A tomb sentinel's unbreakable vow met an immovable force of arrogance. For the first time in his sacred duty, the guard moved. But the reason wasn't in any training manual. It was hidden in a little girl's silent tears. The air over Arlington National Cemetery hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and the collective weight of memory. It was Memorial Day. Under a vast, cerulean sky, the sun cast a brilliant, almost holy light upon the endless rows of white marble headstones. They stood in silent, perfect formation, a sprawling city of the dead, each stone a monument to a life given in service. The usual quiet reverence of the grounds was amplified by the presence of thousands. Families moved with a gentle solemnity between the graves, their hushed conversations like prayers carried on the warm breeze. Veterans, their backs straighter than their years should allow, stood adorned with medals that glinted like captured sunlight. At the heart of it all was the tomb of the unknown soldier, a hallowed stage for the day's most sacred ritual. Manning an outer post on the pathway leading to the plaza was Sergeant Leo Martinez. At 30, his face was a study in disciplined control, with a jawline that seemed carved from the same marble as the tombs he guarded and deep-set eyes that held a sorrow older than his years. His uniform was a masterpiece of precision. The deep blue fabric without a single crease, the white gloves immaculate, the M14 rifle held with a familiarity that made it seem an extension of his own arm. For 3 years, Leo had walked this line, his life measured in 21-step counts and 21-second pauses. It was a duty that demanded nothing less than perfection, a living embodiment of the nation's gratitude. But for Leo, it was more personal. With every click of his heels on the stone, he wasn't just honoring the unknowns. He was guarding the memory of one man he knew all too well, Corporal Miguel Rivera, his best friend. He could still see Miguel's easy grin, hear his laughter echoing in the dusty streets of Kandahar. An IED had stolen that laughter, leaving a silence in Leo's life that even the bustling crowds of Arlington could never fill. This sacred duty was his penance, his promise. He would stand for Miguel, for all the Miguels, with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. His focus was absolute, a shield against the grief that always lingered just beneath the surface. Through this sea of quiet contemplation, a small wheelchair made its way, navigated by a woman with tired but determined eyes. This was Elena Petrova, and in the chair sat her 10-year-old daughter, Lily. Lily's bright, curious eyes drank in the scene, her small hands clutching a worn, laminated photograph. She had been born with spinal muscular atrophy, a condition that confined her body but could never imprison her spirit. The man in the photograph was her father, an Air Force pilot with a smile as wide as the sky he used to command, lost in a training accident when she was barely old enough to form memories of him. "Is that one of them, Mama?" Lily whispered, her voice filled with awe as she pointed toward Leo's distant, stoic figure. "One of the guardians Dad told me about." Elena squeezed her daughter's shoulder, managing a soft smile. "Yes, sweetie, he's one of them. They had driven 6 hours to be here, to fulfill a promise her husband had made to their daughter." He had described the tomb guards as real-life superheroes, silent sentinels who never faltered. For Lily, seeing one up close was like touching a piece of her father's legacy. As they found a small space to watch, Lily held the photo of her father in his flight suit tightly, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and a deep, unspoken longing. The solemn atmosphere was abruptly pierced by a sound as out of place as a scream in a library. The loud, self-important voice of a man on a business call. Richard Sterling, a man in his mid-40s, carved a path through the respectful crowd with the subtlety of a bulldozer. Dressed in an expensive but hopelessly wrinkled suit, he held his phone to his ear like a weapon, his words sharp and dismissive. "Look, the quarterly projections are non-negotiable. I don't care about their supply chain issues. Make it happen." He moved with an air of frantic entitlement, his eyes scanning not the hallowed grounds, but the sky, as if searching for a better cell signal. His path of disruption led him to a small, makeshift memorial a family had set up by a tree, a small bouquet of flowers, and a handwritten note. Without breaking stride, he nearly kicked it over, catching himself at the last second with an annoyed grunt, not of apology, but of inconvenience. He was a creature of Wall Street, a predator of the stock market, and this sacred space was just another obstacle between him and his next multi-million-dollar deal. The quiet murmurs of the crowd followed him like a ripple of discontent, but he was deaf to them, insulated by his own bubble of ambition. He finally found his spot, a place with clear reception, and it happened to be directly in front of Lily Petrova. His broad back, clad in charcoal gray wool, became an impenetrable wall, completely eclipsing her view of Sergeant Martinez and the path to the tomb. Lily craned her neck, her small frame straining, but she could see nothing but the fabric of his suit. Elena waited a moment, hoping he might realize and move. When he didn't, she leaned forward and touched his arm gently. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but firm. "My daughter can't see. Would you mind shifting just a little?" Richard Sterling glanced over his shoulder, his eyes barely registering the girl in the wheelchair. He held up a finger, signaling for her to wait, before barking into his phone, "Hold on, David." He muted the call and turned to Elena, his face a mask of profound irritation. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm in the middle of closing a merger that's worth more than this entire lawn. Can't you just roll her somewhere else?" He gestured vaguely to the side, into a more crowded area, before unmuting his phone and turning his back on them completely. David, back to the acquisition clause. The casual cruelty of his words hung in the air. Somewhere else, as if they were an inconvenience to be managed, a piece of furniture to be moved. Elena felt a flush of anger, but she looked down at Lily, whose face had begun to crumple. She took a deep breath, her protective instincts overriding her shock. The crowd around them began to shift uncomfortably. A few people shot Sterling openly hostile glares. The silent, respectful tapestry of the day had been torn, and the raw, ugly threads of the outside world were showing through. For the first time, a flicker of movement registered in Leo Martinez's peripheral vision. It was nothing, just a slight disturbance in the crowd, but it was a discordant note in a perfectly composed symphony. The tension around Richard Sterling began to coalesce, thickening the humid air. An elderly man standing nearby, wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap, leaned toward his wife and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "This is hallowed ground, not the damn boardroom." Sterling, whose hearing was apparently as sharp as his business acumen, caught the remark. He spun around, his face reddening with indignation. "I pay my taxes," he snapped, his voice carrying across the lawn. "That gives me the right to stand wherever I please. This place is open to the public, isn't it?" He wasn't just defensive. He was aggressive, turning his personal inconvenience into a public declaration of his rights. He then fixed his gaze on Elena, his contempt now undisguised. "You want a nice view? Take her to a park," he sneered. "This is a place to commemorate sacrifice, not a theme park for your daughter's entertainment." The word sacrifice struck a nerve in the crowd. It was the very reason they were all there. Elena recoiled as if slapped. "My husband made the ultimate sacrifice," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. "He was an Air Force pilot. We are here to honor him." Sterling actually rolled his eyes. Right, everyone's got a story. He was completely impervious to the emotional weight of the place, to the pain in Elena's voice. His own stress-fueled world was the only reality he recognized. Frustrated with his phone call and the growing disapproval of the crowd, he paced impatiently. In a sharp, angry pivot, he failed to notice how close he was to Lily's wheelchair. The toe of his polished Italian loafer struck the metal spokes of the wheel with a sickening clang. The impact jolted the chair. Lily let out a small cry of fright, and the worn photograph of her father slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the dusty ground. The crowd gasped collectively. This was no longer a matter of rudeness. It was a physical violation, an act of desecration. The photograph lay face down on the gravel path, a forgotten memory under the heel of arrogance. Sterling glanced down at the fallen picture with utter indifference. "It's fine," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Then, in an act of supreme hubris, he gestured mockingly towards Sergeant Martinez's unmoving form. "Hey, look at that statue over there," he said with a smirk to the man on his phone. "He's not doing anything. Useless." That was it. The final straw. A wave of outrage rippled through the onlookers. Whispers turned into angry murmurs. "Get him out of here," someone said. The insult wasn't just to the guard. It was to the uniform, to the flag, to every soul buried beneath their feet. And from his post, though his body remained a statue of discipline, Leo Martinez heard every word. The insult echoed in the silent space where he kept the memory of Miguel. Useless. He and Miguel had made a promise to protect the innocent. A promise that transcended any line drawn on a plaza. Behind the stoic mask of Sergeant Leo Martinez, a war was raging. Every fiber of his being, conditioned by 3 years of relentless training, screamed at him to remain still. The Sentinel does not move. The Sentinel does not speak. The Sentinel is a symbol. The words of the creed were etched into his soul. But another, older creed was clawing its way to the surface. The promise he'd made to a dying Miguel in the dust of Kandahar. "Watch over them, Leo. Watch over the good people." He saw the little girl flinch. He saw the photograph of a fellow serviceman lying in the dirt. He heard the word useless hurled like a stone at the very ideal of sacrifice he had dedicated his life to honoring. In that instant, the abstract concept of the unknown soldier became intensely personal. They had families. They had daughters. They had been men who would have shielded that little girl without a second thought. His duty wasn't to the stone and marble. It was to the spirit they represented. The war lasted only a second, but it changed everything. With a decision made, his body followed. There was a sound, a single sharp click of polished leather heels pivoting on stone. It was a sound every guard made, but this one was different. It was off rhythm. It was a deviation. He turned, not 90 degrees, not 180, but just enough to face the disturbance. Then he took a step. He stepped off the sacred red carpet that marked his patrol. A collective gasp swept through the plaza. It was as if the Washington Monument had just leaned over. Phones that had been passively recording were now held aloft with trembling hands. The low murmur of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Leo Martinez moved with a deliberate, almost surreal grace. His strides were measured, powerful, eating up the distance between his post and Richard Sterling. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. The sheer, unprecedented nature of his action commanded the scene. His rifle remained perfectly at his side, a symbol of disciplined power. He stopped directly in front of Sterling, his shadow falling over the businessman. Leo was not an exceptionally tall man, but in his uniform, with the weight of Arlington at his back, he seemed a giant. Sterling, who had been mid-sentence, froze, his mouth agape. "WH, what are you doing?" he stammered, the bravado draining from his face. "You're not allowed to." Leo's voice, when it came, was not a shout. It was low, calm, and carried the unshakable authority of a drill sergeant. "Sir, you will step back. Now." It was not a request. It was a command that resonated with the force of an order on the battlefield. Sterling, for the first time that day, was rendered speechless. He stumbled back a step, then another. Leo paid him no further attention. His focus shifted entirely. He turned to Lily, and the hard lines of his face softened. In one fluid, practiced motion, he bent his knee and knelt, the perfect crease of his trousers meeting the ground. He brought himself down to her level, the stoic guardian, now a gentle protector. His gloved hand reached down and carefully picked up the fallen photograph. With his thumb, he gently wiped a smudge of dust from the pilot's smiling face before holding out to her. "He would be very proud of you," Leo said, his voice now a quiet murmur meant only for her. He was a hero. Tears welled in Lily's eyes, but this time they were not of sadness. She took the photo, her small fingers brushing against his white glove. She nodded, unable to speak. In that single, silent exchange, a bond was forged, a shared understanding of service, sacrifice, and the love that endures beyond loss. The moment stretched, captured by dozens of phone cameras, a tableau of honor confronting arrogance. The soft click of shutters was the only sound that dared to break the spell. Then, from the side of the plaza, another figure approached, moving with the quiet authority that comes from decades of service. It was Sergeant Major Wallace, a tall, imposing black man whose stern face was a familiar sight to every sentinel at the tomb. As the man responsible for the guards, his presence signaled an official intervention. A knot of anxiety tightened in the crowd. The guard had done the right thing, but he had broken the most sacred of rules. Would he be punished? Sergeant Major Wallace came to a halt, his polished boots just inches from Leo. His eyes, sharp and discerning, took in the entire scene in a single, sweeping glance. Leo still kneeling by the wheelchair, the tearful but grateful faces of Lily and Elena, the cowed and humiliated Richard Sterling, and the sea of onlookers who were now watching him, waiting for his verdict. He looked at Leo, and for a fraction of a second, his gaze softened with something that looked like understanding, even pride. But his voice was pure regulation. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, his tone even and impossible to read. "Return to your post." Leo rose to his feet, his movements crisp and immediate. He gave a slight, respectful nod to Lily, then pivoted and marched back to the red carpet, resuming his solitary vigil as if nothing had happened. The crowd held its breath. Then, Sergeant Major Wallace turned his attention to Richard Sterling. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Sir," he said, and the word carried an iron weight. He gestured to two uniformed cemetery officials who had materialized at his side. "These gentlemen will escort you from the premises." "Now, wait a minute," Sterling began, a flicker of his old bluster returning. "I have a right to be here." "Your rights ended when you chose to disrespect this ground and its visitors." Wallace cut him off, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing. "Leave. Now." There was no room for argument. Defeated, Sterling was led away, his multi-million-dollar phone call forgotten. He fumbled with his phone, trying to pretend he was busy, but the burning stares of the crowd followed him every step of the way. He had entered as a titan of industry. He left as a petty footnote in someone else's story of heroism. As Sterling disappeared, a ripple of soft, respectful applause broke out among the onlookers. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was a heartfelt affirmation of what they had just witnessed. Sergeant Major Wallace ignored it, turning instead to Elena and Lily. Before he could speak, Leo, from his post, took one more unprecedented action. He broke his 21-second pause 2 seconds early, took a single step toward the mother and daughter, and with a subtle nod of his head, indicated a spot right at the edge of the restricted area. A perfect, unobstructed view. Elena, her face streaming with tears, whispered, "Thank you." She pushed Lily's chair to the spot. The crowd instinctively parted for them, creating a clear path. From her new vantage point, Lily had the best view in the house, a view worthy of a hero's daughter. Before the final guard change was even complete, the videos began to surface online. They were shaky and filmed from a dozen different angles, but they all told the same powerful story. The titles were variations on a theme. Tomb Guard Shatters Tradition to Defend a Little Girl and Real Heroism at Arlington. The clips went viral within hours. The comment sections exploded, not with the usual internet vitriol, but with an overwhelming wave of support. Veterans shared stories of their own service. Gold Star families expressed their gratitude. Thousands of ordinary people typed out messages of respect for Sergeant Martinez's actions. The next morning, the U.S. Army's official statement was a masterclass in diplomacy. The Sentinels of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier are held to the highest standards of discipline and tradition. It began. However, the core of that tradition is a profound respect for the service and sacrifice the tomb represents. In extraordinary circumstances, an act of compassion that upholds that honor is not a breach of duty, but its highest expression. There would be no reprimand for Leo Martinez. In the quiet corridors of the barracks, he was met not with discipline, but with silent, approving nods from his brothers-in-arms. For Lily Petrova, the day became a defining memory. The image of the Sentinel kneeling before her was more powerful than any story. It gave her a tangible connection to the abstract idea of her father's heroism. She understood that the uniform represented not just strength, but a deep, protective kindness. And for Leo, something had shifted. His solitary walk was no longer just a penance for a friend he had lost. It had become a living watch over the values they had both sworn to defend. He was guarding more than a tomb. He was guarding the hope that decency and honor could still win the day. That one small, righteous step could echo louder than all the noise of a disrespectful world. The rules we live by are meant to give us order, to guide us. But what happens when those rules conflict with our own humanity? When is it right to step off the line? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please, comment with respect. If this story moved you, show your support by liking and sharing, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of the quiet heroes who walk among us.